So, imagine for a second that you walked into a Christian gathering in like first century Europe.
You'd probably be hiding in a dark catacomb somewhere, right?
Exactly. I mean, you'd be in this subterranean pitch black space because the continent was just this patchwork of pagan empires and tribal territories. Practicing this new faith was essentially a death sentence.
It was incredibly dangerous.
But, and this is the wild part, if you travel to the tropical, sun-drenched coast of India at that exact same time, you'd encounter a completely different reality.
A total geographical reset of how we usually view ancient history.
Right. You would find this thriving community of Christians who, they weren't hiding at all. In fact, they were this powerful local elite. We're talking about people riding elephants, collecting taxes, and operating as a major socioeconomic force.
It really shatters our conventional mental timeline, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're so heavily conditioned to view the spread of this faith as this slow westward crawl through Europe.
Yeah, like it only reached the rest of the world centuries later through, colonialism.
Exactly. But to realize that an eastern branch was flourishing in India while Rome was still, well, literally feeding believers to lions, it's just incredible.
Okay, let's unpack this because today's deep dive is centered entirely on that exact community. The St. Thomas Christians, or the Nasranis of Kerala, India.
Right.
We're going to look at how they built the society, but more importantly, we're exploring how their existence was documented, validated, and later, unfortunately, weaponized by one very specific 4th century Western scholar.
St. Jerome.
Yes, St. Jerome.
And this narrative, it stretches so far beyond just religious history. I mean, we are looking at ancient global trade networks,
Yeah.
linguistic riddles that confuse scholars for centuries.
All the linguistic riddles are my favorite part.
They're amazing. And, it's also about the raw power of the written word.
Yeah.
It's really a masterclass in how historical text can be used either as a bridge to connect isolated continents or as a blunt instrument to just erase an entire culture's identity.
So to understand why a 4th century scholar sitting in the Middle East was even writing about an Indian community, we have to start at the beginning.
Right, the logistics of it.
Yeah. Like, if I'm looking at a map of the 1st century, how does a missionary even get from the Mediterranean all the way down to the southern tip of India?
Well, it wasn't through, like, miraculous levitation or just aimless wandering. It was driven by meteorology and, honestly, cold, hard economics.
The spice trade. Right.
Exactly. In the 1st century, the Greco-Roman world had this massive appetite for Indian spices, specifically black pepper. And to feed that demand, sailors had mastered what are called the Hippolyte monsoon winds.
Hippolyte monsoon winds.
Yeah. They're these highly predictable seasonal winds that blow across the Indian Ocean. If you caught the wind at the exact right time, the ocean essentially turned into a maritime superhighway.
Wow.
It could carry a ship directly from the Red Sea straight to the Malabar coast of India.
So an apostle basically just hops onto a Roman pepper trading vessel.
Pretty much, yeah.
Where do the historical traditions say he actually made landfall?
The tradition places the Apostle Thomas at the ancient port city of Muziris. This is in Kerala, India, in the year AD 52.
AD 52, that is incredibly early.
It is. And, he didn't just step off the boat and start preaching to random strangers on the beach. He implemented a very pragmatic strategy. He sought out the Jewish trading colonies.
Oh, right.
Yeah, these settlements had already been established in Kerala since the 1st century BC.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're a lone Aramaic-speaking traveler arriving in a completely foreign land, you're going to look for a linguistic anchor.
You find the people who understand your theological framework, right? The Jewish diaspora in India provided Thomas with, well, a receptive audience and a base of operations.
And from there, the mission moved inward.
Exactly. They established what local tradition refers to as the 7.5 churches.
I read about a few of those. One of the key locations was Pelior, right?
Yes, Pelior.
And there's this famous water miracle associated with it. Why was that specific spot so crucial?
Well, Pelior was a major intellectual and religious center for high-caste Hindu Brahmins. And local oral history preserves this very specific narrative about how Thomas actually gained their attention.
Right, the water miracle.
Yeah. So the story goes that Thomas was walking by a temple pool, and he saw Brahmins throwing water into the air as an offering to the sun. And Thomas essentially challenges the efficacy of their ritual.
He asks them why the sun lets the water fall back down if it's supposedly accepted the offering.
Exactly. And then Thomas throws water into the air himself. And according to the tradition, the water just hovered there, suspended in midair.
I mean, you could imagine the visual impact of something like that on a highly religious society.
Oh, absolutely.
But I have like a fundamental question about the aftermath of this. Even with a compelling message or, a reported miracle, how does a foreign missionary successfully convert deeply entrenched high caste Hindu families?
The great question.
Because usually adopting a new foreign religion means abandoning your social standing, right? You become an outsider.
Right, but the mechanism of their success here was radical integration. Thomas and his successors didn't demand that these new converts strip away their Indian identity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they didn't force them to abandon the local social hierarchy. They used the Periyar estuary as this economic hub and basically embedded themselves into the fabric of Kerala.
So they kept their social customs intact.
Yes, they just swapped out the theology at the center of those customs.
It's like, I was thinking about this earlier, it's like they wove this cultural triple braid.
A triple braid, I like that.
Yeah, you have Hindu social customs dictating how they live their daily life, Christian theology dictating their spiritual beliefs, and Syrian liturgical practices dictating how they worship.
Yes, all braided together into a single unbreakable identity.
That's fascinating.
And because they managed that integration so seamlessly, the local rulers viewed them as a massive asset. The Nizranis were granted a social status roughly equivalent to the Nairs.
And the Nairs were like the warrior caste, right?
Yeah, exactly. The powerful warrior and ruling caste in Kerala. So the Nizranis weren't pushed to the margins at all. They were actually handed 72 royal privileges.
The Thasakad Sasanam.
Right. Legally inscribed on copper plates.
I was reading about some of those privileges, and they are just astonishing. They had the right to use ceremonial umbrellas.
Which was a huge status symbol.
Right. And the right to ride elephants and the legal authority to collect taxes. I mean, they were essentially operating as a medieval socioeconomic powerhouse.
They absolutely were. And their geographic footprint expanded as well. Tradition holds that after spending years in Kerala, Thomas crossed the subcontinent to the eastern Coromandel coast.
And that's where he was eventually martyred, right?
Yes, in AD 72 at a place called Mylapore near modern-day Chennai.
But, thriving locally isn't always enough to protect a community from the shifting tides of history.
No, it rarely is.
They were preserving their story through these amazing local oral traditions, lyrical poems like the Ramban song, and all these intricate cultural dances like the Margam Kali.
Which are beautiful.
They are. But to survive on a global scale, they needed their Indian apostolate to be recognized by the broader Western Church.
They needed a PR boost in the West.
Exactly, they needed a bridge. Which brings us to the late 4th century and a man named Saint Jerome.
Sitting in Bethlehem.
Right. Now, Jerome is this intellectual titan of the Latin Church. He lived in Bethlehem for over 30 years, and Bethlehem was basically right at the geographic choke point between the Roman Empire and the East.
Yeah, instead of picturing a monk just like isolated in a cave, we should really picture him as an ancient intelligence analyst.
A 4th century Wikipedia.
Exactly. She's sitting at this major intersection, debriefing pilgrims, merchants, travelers coming off the trade routes. He's constantly aggregating data about the wider world.
And he deploys this intelligence in some very specific theological battles back in Rome.
He really does. For example, around AD 395 or 396, he writes this famous text, Letter 59, to a Roman matron named Marcella. The Roman Church was having this fierce debate about the omnipresence of the divine nature. Essentially, if Christ had ascended to heaven, how could he be present everywhere on earth at the exact same time?
And Jerome answers this by mapping out the apostles, right?
Right. He lists where they all are to prove a point. He says Peter is in Rome, Paul is in Illyricum, Andrew is in Achaia, and Thomas is in India.
Wait, let me make a deduction here.
Go for it.
If Jerome is writing a letter to a Roman audience, and he's trying to win a complex theological argument, he has to use evidence that his audience already trusts.
Mm-hmm.
So if he casually brings up Thomas in India to prove his point, doesn't that mean the Roman public already accepted the Indian apostolate as a hard, undisputed fact?
What's fascinating here is how clearly the textual record supports your deduction.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of the 4th century, the idea of Thomas in India was not a fringe theory.
It was just accepted reality.
Yes, it was a cross-patristic consensus. You had other major intellectual heavyweights like Ambrose of Milan writing about it.
Oh.
Yeah, and John Chrysostom, another massive figure. He was actively comparing the spiritual gravity of Thomas's tomb in India to the tombs of Peter and Paul in Rome.
That is a staggering level of validation for the Nazarenes, and Jerome pushes it even further. In his compilation called De Viris Illustribus on Illustrious Men, he ranks Thomas first geographically.
Because he went to the ends of the earth.
Right, and Jerome uses this geographical data to literally guilt trip his own people.
Oh, he was great at that.
He was. In letter 107, he tells a Roman woman named Laida, look, even the furthest nations in India are transforming spiritually. You have zero excuse to be lazy about your faith here in Rome.
And, he wasn't just relying on spiritual rumors either. In his epistle ad Evangelium, he explicitly references the Indian city of Muziris.
The pepper trade hub.
Exactly. He knows it is the epicenter of the Roman pepper trade. He understood the economic tether between Rome and the Malabar coast, which grounded his theological writings in harsh geographical reality.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Oh, yeah. The second mission.
Yes. Because while Jerome was digging into the archives, he documented a completely different mission to India from the 2nd century, one that stumbled into this massive linguistic riddle.
The mission of Pantaenus.
Right. So who was he?
Pantaenus was the head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, Egypt, which, by the way, was one of the greatest intellectual hubs of the ancient world.
Oh, absolutely.
Around AD 180 or 190, the Bishop of Alexandria dispatched Pantaenus to travel to India and engage philosophically with the Brahmins.
And when Pantaenus arrives, he finds a community of Christians already there, clutching a copy of the Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew characters.
Right.
But the twist, and this is so good, the local Christians tell Pantaenus that their gospel was given to them by the Apostle Bartholomew, not Thomas.
Which sparked a scholarly debate that lasted for centuries. Because how do we explain Bartholomew showing up in the Indian historical record when all the local tradition points to Thomas?
Did some scholars think Pantaenus just went to the wrong place?
They did. Some Western scholars tried to solve this by suggesting Pantaenus didn't actually go to India at all. They thought maybe he ended up in South Arabia or somewhere else.
But Jerome debunks that.
Completely. Jerome explicitly writes that Pantaenus went to debate the Brahmins, which firmly places him on the Indian subcontinent.
So, if we rule out a geographic mix-up, how did Bartholomew's name get into the story? This is where the historical game of telephone comes in.
It's the perfect way to describe it. Indian historians offer a linguistic explanation that explains the mechanism perfectly. Pantaenus did not speak the local dialect.
Naturally.
So when he asked the community who founded their church, they likely replied Mar Thoma, which is the Syriac term for Lord Thomas.
Lord Thoma.
Right. But to Pantaenus, a Greek speaker from Alexandria, the unfamiliar syllables of Mar Thoma sounded incredibly similar to Bartolomai.
Bartolomai. And that's the Aramaic root of the name Bartholomew. It's literally like a tourist visiting a foreign country, mishearing the local pronunciation of a town, writing it down in their journal, and accidentally renaming the city in the official Western archives for 1,000 years.
That's exactly what happened.
Maritama maps onto Bartolomai, and the truth gets buried. And this isn't even the only time linguistic confusion warped the record. What about the mystery of Calamina?
Oh, the Calamina riddle is a perfect case study in how written text can obscure reality.
How so?
Well, Western patristic sources, driven heavily by Jerome's writings, uniformly declared that the Apostle Thomas was martyred in an Indian city called Calamina.
Okay.
But for centuries, Western cartographers and historians couldn't find Calamina on any map of India.
Because it didn't exist. Meanwhile, the local Indian oral tradition had never stopped insisting that Thomas died at Mylapore.
Right.
So how do Mylapore and Calamina connect?
It comes down to philology again. Calamina isn't a city. It is a Latin corruption of a regional title. The area surrounding Mylapore was historically controlled by the Chola dynasty. In the local Tamil language, that realm was called Cholamandalam.
Cholamandalam.
Right. When early Greek merchants traveled there, they struggled to pronounce Cholamandalam and transliterated it into Greek as Calamine.
And then Jerome and the Latin scholars read the Greek Calamine and Latinized it into Calamina.
Exactly.
That is just brilliant. Jerome and the Indian locals were pointing to the exact same piece of earth. They were just separated by 3 layers of bad translation.
It perfectly reconciles the Western texts with the local geography.
And beyond the geography, Jerome harbored this deep respect for Indian culture. He wrote extensively about the Indian gymnosophists, which was a term for naked ascetic philosophers.
He was completely captivated by their discipline.
Yeah.
He documented how they lived entirely on fruits and herbs, refused meat and wine, and practiced this extreme physical self-denial.
And just like he did with the geography, he used their lifestyle to criticize Roman excess in his work Ad versus Juvenianum.
We can view this as a remarkably positive form of early Orientalism. Jerome didn't look at India as a primitive, backwards frontier that needed to be saved by Rome.
No, he viewed it as a spiritual peer.
Exactly. The intense discipline of the Indian ascetics actively inspired the development of Latin monasticism.
But, knowing how deeply Jerome respected them makes the next chapter of this history incredibly painful.
It really does.
For over a millennium, Jerome's writings stood as the ultimate Western validation of the Nasrani identity. But when European colonial powers finally arrived on the Indian coast, they took Jerome's greatest literary achievement and used it to dismantle the culture he admired.
Yeah. The turning point occurs with the arrival of the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama lands in India in 1498.
And at first they were thrilled, right?
Oh, initially the Portuguese sailors are overjoyed. Finding an ancient, pre-existing Christian community right in the middle of the spice routes felt like a divine blessing.
But that joy sours into hostility pretty fast.
Almost immediately.
Why the sudden shift, though? I mean, if they were all Christians, shouldn't they have been allies?
You would think so, but the tension was entirely theological and structural. The Nazarenes did not look, sound, or worship like European Catholics.
Right, they had that Syrian liturgy from the Triple Braid.
Yes. They belonged to the East Syrian tradition. They practiced the Chaldean rite, which means their liturgy was sung in Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, the actual language spoken by Jesus.
Wow.
And their spiritual authority wasn't the Pope in Rome, it was the Patriarch of the Church of the East in Mesopotamia.
And to the Portuguese, who were arriving straight out of their rigid, hyper-Orthodox environment of the European Counter-Reformation, anything that wasn't strictly Roman Catholic was viewed as a mortal threat.
Exactly. They immediately branded the ancient Indian practices as the Nestorian heresy.
Which raises an important question about what that label actually meant, because the Nestorian heresy refers to a deeply nuanced 5th century theological dispute, right? About how the human and divine natures of Christ coexisted.
Right. The Roman Church believed the natures were perfectly unified. They accused the Nestorians of separating the human and divine too much.
But did the Nasranis actually believe that?
Whether they actually believed it or not was irrelevant to the Portuguese. The label of heretic gave the Europeans the moral justification they needed to initiate a cultural purge.
But here's what I don't understand. We established earlier that the Nasranis were an elite caste with 72 royal privileges. They literally rode elephants.
Yes.
So how does a fleet of newly arrived Portuguese sailors manage to overpower a deeply rooted, wealthy, socioeconomic bloc?
Well, the mechanism was brutal maritime economics and gunboat diplomacy. The Portuguese possessed superior naval artillery.
Okay.
This allowed them to establish a monopoly over the ocean trade rights. They essentially blockaded the spice trade. If a local Indian Raja wanted to keep selling pepper, he had to play ball with the Portuguese.
So the Europeans leveraged this economic stranglehold to force the local rulers to withdraw their political protection from the Nasranis.
Exactly. Isolating the Christian community completely.
They cut off their economic oxygen. And that isolation culminates in the year 1599 at the infamous Synod of Diamper.
Orchestrated by the Portuguese Archbishop Aleixo de Meneses of Goa.
Right. And his decrees essentially amounted to the forced Latinization of the entire Nasrani culture.
And here's where St. Jerome's legacy is weaponized against them. Jerome's greatest contribution to history was the Vulgate, the definitive Latin translation of the Bible.
Right.
At the Synod of Diamper, the Portuguese declared that the Vulgate was the only acceptable version of Scripture. They used Jerome's text to forcibly correct the indigenous Syriac Peshitta.
Wait, what was the Peshitta exactly?
The Peshitta was the standard Syriac version of the Bible that the Indian Christians had used for over 1,000 years.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The Portuguese demanded that the Aramaic texts be altered to match the Latin Vulgate.
It's the equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, the new Portuguese management doesn't just demote the existing leaders. They seize the ancient employee handbooks, cross out the founding principles, and force the staff to operate in a completely foreign language.
Exactly.
When you replace Aramaic theological concepts with Latin terms from the Vulgate-like, replacing the Eastern concept of mystery with the rigid Latin legalism of sacramentum, you are just changing words. You are rewiring their entire worldview.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the linguistic purge was just the first step. To ensure compliance, The Portuguese systematically brained the community's Syriac books.
Just erased their history.
Their books, their ancient liturgies, their historical records. Furthermore, they legally banned the Hindu-influenced social customs that made up that triple braid we discussed.
So they outlawed the tying of the minuet at weddings.
Yes, and forbade participation in local cultural events like the Onam festivals.
They took a beautifully adapted, ancient Indian expression of faith and just violently crammed it into a standardized European box.
The historical irony is staggering. In the 4th century, Jerome looked at Indian asceticism and used it as a model to teach arrogant Romans what true devotion looked like.
Right.
A millennium later, the Portuguese used Jerome's Latin Vulgate to teach the Indians how to be properly Christian, deliberately suppressing the exact indigenous traditions that Jerome had revered.
But the Nasranis refused to be erased. The pressure cooker finally exploded, right?
It did, in 1653.
Thousands of St. Thomas Christians marched to Matancherry, tied ropes to a stone cross so everyone could touch it, and took the Coonan Cross oath.
A massively significant moment.
They publicly swore they would never again submit to the Portuguese or the Jesuit hierarchy.
It was an incredible act of defiance. The oath fundamentally fractured the community, leading to the complex divisions of the Syro-Malabar Catholic and Malabar Orthodox branches that exist today, but it ensured their survival.
They refused to let a colonial power sever their apostolic roots. So what does this all mean for you listening today? We've navigated monsoon trade winds, linguistic mix-ups, theological standoffs, and colonial blockades. The survival of the St. Thomas Christians is a masterclass in historical resilience.
Absolutely.
They navigated the complex social landscape of Brahmin society and withstood the aggressive economic ambitions of Europe by anchoring themselves to one unshakable identity. They were the direct heirs of the apostle who traveled the furthest.
And, this narrative provides a vital lesson regarding the power dynamics of information. We clearly see that knowledge, specifically written text, is an immensely powerful tool, but is only a tool.
Right.
A text like Jerome's writings can be used to build a bridge, proving that distant cultures are profoundly connected. Or, in the hands of an imperial power, that same text can be used as a weapon to overwrite and erase a vibrant identity.
The impact of the text entirely depends on who is holding the pen and what they stand to gain.
Well said.
And that is exactly the thought I want to leave you with today. Throughout this deep dive, we saw how the official written records of the West, like the creation of the word Kalamina, actually obscured the historical reality. Meanwhile, the oral traditions of the Nasranis, their local songs, and generational memories about Cholamandalam and the trade routes preserved the precise truth for centuries. It begs a haunting question. If oral history is often the more accurate record, how many other ancient, thriving, cross-cultural communities were entirely erased from existence simply because they didn't have an intelligence analyst like Jerome to write them down in the right language for the distant empires?
It's a sobering thought.
Next time you read a history book, ask yourself not just what is written on the page, but whose voice was left out in the wind. We'll see you on the next deep dive.